everyone, and welcome to a test-driven approach to documenting RESTful APIs with Spring REST docs. I'm Jen Strater, and the best way to follow me is on Twitter. It's Code Generator. Thought it was a pretty funny pun. And so just a little bit of logistics to get started. These slides are published on SpeakerDeck. A tweet should have gone out a few minutes ago that has all of these links. If you want to come back to them later, there are 3 links to the example projects. So to get started, a little bit about me. I am originally American, but I am currently taking classes at the Technical University of Denmark and working on a research project to contribute back to the static analysis tool for Groovy called CodeNarc. My funding comes from a program called the US Fulbright grant program, and part of that means that I also get to do things like go out and talk and explore Danish culture. Prior to my Fulbright grant, I was a senior consultant at a company called Object Partners. They're a consulting shop out of Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States. The work that I did for them is the subject of this talk. You may also know me as the co-founder of an organization called Great Ladies. So Great Ladies is an organization to support women and try to get more women into the Groovy community all over the world. This has led me to do several talks as well as to start a workshop series called Great Workshops. It's very similar to something like a Rails bridge. On the Saturday, we just do kind of like an intro and then provide resources, books, tutorials, places you can go to learn more. Next thing is that my grant is coming to an end, so I will be looking for work soon. So particularly if you know of anything remote, let me know. So that is a little bit, well, a lot about me. I also want to get an idea of what you guys want to see. So I assume if you're here, you at least have some idea of how to create a RESTful API. So my background is in Groovy, so these are 3 frameworks that we can relate to. And so just kind of by a show of hands, who is at least familiar, even if not with Groovy, with Spring Boot? Okay, so majority of the room. And who's done a little bit more Groovy? Who is familiar with Grails? Handful, maybe 10 or 12. Okay, so Grails, if you're not familiar, is a framework that sits on top of Spring Boot, and you get a lot of extra additional functionality. The third thing that I expect not many people in the room have experience with is Ratpack. Is there anyone? 1, 2. Okay. So Ratpack is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. It's a really lightweight framework that lives in the Groovy and Java space and is used a lot in asynchronous processing. But the thing that makes it really exciting or interesting to talk about in regards to documenting APIs is that it has dynamic route handling, and that makes it really difficult for any kind of code-generated documentation to work. So when you have created APIs, what kind of tools are you using for documentation? And of course, this is not a complete list, but just kind of 2 different types of things. So who has used Swagger or some sort of code-generated documentation? Okay, so most of the room. And who is familiar with using ASCII Doctor just to write regular plain documentation or any experience with ASCII Doctor at all? Okay, a few. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that is then. And like I said, this isn't a fully inclusive list, but just the 2 that I'm going to talk about today. So now that you know a little bit about me and I know a little bit about you, I feel pretty confident that I can share my secret. I hate writing documentation. And I should probably clarify this a little bit because it's not the documentation that I don't like writing. I actually think that having really good docs is very important and very vital to any API project. The thing that makes it frustrating to write documentation is having to write the same thing over and over again. So when I was tasked in the fall of 2015 with coming up with a centralized way to document all of our APIs across our enterprise team, I wasn't really thrilled with the idea of writing them out manually. So I thought there has to be a better way to document APIs other than just writing them out. So we started this project to look at different technologies, and eventually what we picked was Spring REST docs. So as we worked through our APIs, we found a few different things in common between all of them. So the first thing that kind of came up was where our APIs fell in this REST maturity model. So if you aren't familiar with the riches of maturity model, I actually found this first from a blog post from Martin Fowler. The link is in there, probably a little bit tiny, but if you download the slides after, you should be able to get to that. And the idea here is that you have different categories before you even have an API that's truly RESTful. And the APIs that we found in our organization actually weren't RESTful at all. They mostly fell in this level 1 to level 2 category. They weren't necessarily using HTTP verbs correctly, and it had a lot of ways that we could improve it. But that doesn't mean that in the future we don't want to do things like have hypermedia in our APIs. So this was an important thing when we came to look at the documentation tools, because if you look at a tool like Swagger, they don't support hypermedia. So if we went this direction, we wouldn't, well, at least the version that was available at that time didn't, we wouldn't be able to use that for that kind of API. The next kind of common theme that came up was the way to organize the data. So this is, on the left, an example of the standard Swagger UI. It's very URI focused. And one thing that came up very early on is, and some of our projects were already using this, is that it wasn't immediately evident what some of these things were. So if I knew that I wanted to do a certain concept, I had to figure out what the developers had named that resource and then figure out how to navigate to that part of it. One approach that we liked a little more, which is the one that Spring REST docs uses, is more of a resource-focused or a topic-focused thing that we could go through, okay, I want to do this, and then show me what the URI and everything is to do that. The next thing that came up was how do we do central information? So I don't want to continually write all of the possible HTTP verbs that a single endpoint has. So I can document these in one place and forget about it. And that's something that a lot of different solutions support. The next thing is that we get to this point where architecture is evolving, particularly in APIs, and moving more towards smaller microservices. And even now, the project that we're working on ended up with some strange things with multi-tiered and API gateways. And so it was important that across this big project that had gotten split up into smaller microservices, that our documentation has a consistent look and feel, and that we are able to kind of show how things work together, particularly if it's behind like a gateway. So there were two tools that we looked at. The first one, of course, is Swagger. So Swagger is not just about documentation. It is a standardization for APIs that can be used for lots of different things, including creating client libraries, and I think most everybody in here had at least an idea of what Swagger is coming in. So there are two approaches in the world of the three frameworks that I talked about. And the first one is a library called Spring Fox. And this was something that came up very early on because it's very easy to set up. You just have a couple dependencies, and it can, and then you have to configure a few things in your application main. But it works out of the box, and you get some sort of documentation. So like I said, yeah, really simple, just two dependencies there. And the difference here being that, so the first one is just to get your Swagger specification, and then the second one is optional. So that is if you want to use the Swagger UI. The other option that we had was to go to not use a library that may have some issues, but to go through and create a custom Swagger, now the newer version, the Open API specification. But I already kind of mentioned that I don't like having to write things out manually, particularly when this was a huge team. I didn't want to have to enforce that every time someone else made a change that the specification also changes. Okay, so the next thing, after you decide how to get your actual Swagger specification, is what to use for the UI. So you can use the library that SpringFox provides that kind of sets up some defaults, or you could take the project and copy it, and we could maintain our own version, particularly things that needed to be overwritten. Okay. So as we went through, there were a few things and a few points that made it difficult to use this in our APIs. And the first one was having to do with customization. So in one of the APIs in particular, we were using OAuth tokens, and we had this custom header, and out of the box it didn't support it. So we noticed that we were doing more and more things to override the defaults, and it was losing some of its advantages. The next problem that you may have noticed too is that you get into this concept of having way too many annotations. This is not a particularly long example, but it's one that fits on my slides. And it is one that I actually pulled from code that's in production, then renamed everything. So this may be a little bit difficult to read because all of these annotations are just related to the data model. And there's no verification that this is even correct. So if we take out those extra annotations, we get something that's much smaller. If you amplify that across a huge project with lots of endpoints, that's a lot of extra code, and it makes everything harder to read. The next kind of thing that came up was that we were having trouble with object mapping. We were having to define so many things that just weren't included out of the box. But there's one advantage that makes it really worth looking at, and that is the try it button on the UI. So our QA team in particular really liked this. It was a way that we could communicate what kind of the data was supposed to look like, as well as they could actually try it on a running application. But it kind of made us a little bit lazy in that way too, because we were doing a lot more manual testing and we weren't writing as many unit tests. But there are alternatives. In particular, you can use something like Postman. And so Postman now has an option where you can integrate a run button into your documentation. It is only available for public APIs right now, but you can have this package of endpoints that you can download. You can also go back to old-fashioned curl. Particularly when you use a solution like Spring RESTdocs, you can get those curl statements generated for you, so you don't even have to think about what all of the extra flags are going to be. So if you're still using Swagger in for other reasons, or maybe if you want to continue using it going forward, there are some libraries that I definitely suggest using. So the first one is called Swagger to Markup. So that is, instead of using the SpringFox or the Swagger UI, you can use Markdown instead. And so that will look more like the type that we wanted. We still get a lot of the paths here, but a lot of this can be overwritten, and the sections there can be generated code. The other thing that you definitely want to use is a solution like AssertJSwagger that will assert that whatever your contract is, or to do contract first development, to make sure that your Swagger specification is actually what you intended it to be. Of course, this doesn't verify that this was just what you expected it to be, not actually what was written, particularly when we start talking about refactoring. Okay. So that brings me to this concept of what is test-driven documentation. And the idea that after looking at a code-generated solution, there still has to be something better, right? And the idea is that we take the traditional red-green refactor step and add, you start with your failing test. You have to add some documentation in order for your test to go green. Once you refactor, your tests are going to start failing again. You have to fix your documentation, and you end up in a pipeline that makes sure that your documentation and your actual implemented API are in sync. Okay. So I really like this solution for a few different reasons. And the first thing is that it is ensuring that our documentation actually matches the implementation. We also started writing a lot more tests. So in order to get the documentation, we have to write the test. Maybe you already have the tests. You don't have to write it twice. You can then remove all of that duplicate code that's on your source and in your tests and make your source code easier to read while still getting the advantages of having the tests and the documentation. So in the realm of test-driven documentation, there is a library that we can use called Spring RESTdocs. And just as a little bit of an overview, it is an official Spring project. So it's sponsored by Pivotal. The project lead is one of the Spring developers, Andy Wilkinson. It's currently in release 1.1.2, which was released in August. And then I'll go into a few things that are coming up for that next major release. That is not the official logo. There isn't one, so I made one for my diagrams. And in particular, Spring RESTdocs brings a few things to the table. So it brings generated code snippets, including things like curl statements. It makes sure that your tests fail when your documentation is missing or out of date. And hopefully that also fills your build. You can use it in places where you can't use Swagger. So I was talking about how Ratpack has that dynamic route handling, or if you have hypermedia. So now hopefully that I've convinced you to start looking at least at Spring RESTdocs, you might want to know how to get started. So you should probably start with the documentation. As a documentation project, it has really good docs. There are two other sessions that you might want to look at as well that I highly recommend. Andy Wilkinson's first talk at what was Spring 1.2 GX in 2015. It's a little dated now, but it really does go into the how and the why and how a lot of the internals of this project work. As a follow-up this year at what is now Spring 1 platform, Anders Evers did a very in-depth example project. These two are also good if you want to look at examples that use Java and hypermedia. I'm not going to go into those today because I'm going to bring a slightly different view. But you can look at any of the talks by either of those two, and they all give great talks. Okay. So now that we've actually gone to 1.1.2, there are enough things to actually do a release highlight section. And so I should probably start with 1.0. I was really excited to see this project come out, and it came out right at the time that we needed it when we were doing this analysis. From the very beginning, it supported a testing framework called mockMVC, and it created these auto-generated snippets. The beginning, it was just ASCII doctor integration, but it was very important, even from the very beginning, to support hypermedia. The one that I personally was most excited about was the jump to 1.1. So in 1.1, it added rest assured, which in addition to, so mockMVC has to be in a Spring project, but rest assured really opened it up so that I could do Grails and I could do Ratpack. And I'll go into a little bit more details if we need to on what rest assured is. We also got a few nice features, things like reusable snippets, different testing framework, and you can also use Markdown now if you aren't as happy with ASCII-Doc. So, like I said, the last release was in August, but there are some big things that are coming up that should be really exciting. So if you're looking for an open source project to work on, particularly for like the Hacker Garden, you should take a look at some of these issues. The first one is to get better integration with ASCII-Doctor. So as it sits right now, we're just generating snippets and then you have to manually go in and add those snippets to your documentation. But it would be really nice to have a feature where you can verify that what you're generating is actually being used in your documentation. The other thing is that support for a little bit more complex structures. So this was a very beginning project. It matches simple cases, and in particular it uses tables to represent requests and responses, but when you have something that's deeply nested, that's not the best representation. So I'm actually kind of interested to see how they solve that one. It'd also be kind of nice just to get some refreshes in going up to the 3.0 version of Rest Assured. So what I wanted to bring to this discussion and this is a way to make it groovier. So I guess I should also ask, by show of hands, who is at least familiar with Groovy? Okay, awesome. I am so glad that so many people are familiar with Groovy. So I'm going to go through a Spring Boot example, a Rat-Pack example, and if we have time, a Grails example. So I started with a basic Spring Boot, just a template. I'm going to show how to add the ASCII-Doctor Gradle plugin, how to start with a mock MVC version of the tests, and I'm going to use Spock, which is the super awesome testing framework that uses Groovy. And there are two different ways that you can include documentation in your project if you're not aware. So you can do, I can show how you can do it just by outputting it in your static assets directory, and another example using GitHub pages. So the Spring Boot app is pretty simple. This is the link if you want to take a look at it later. There's a lot more things in there than what I'm going to go over. But it started with a basic lazybones app, and I just added a few trivial endpoints. In this case, I did a greetings resource with a couple different endpoints. If it doesn't look familiar, it's okay. So the first one is just getting all the greetings or doing a search. Second one is a get by ID. And the third one is a post to create a new greeting. Okay. So, and of course you want to replace that with whatever you have existing or the project that you're creating. So at this point, you can add the ASCII-Doctor Gradle plugin, or maybe you already have it in your project. Okay, so ASCII, and a little bit of terminology here. So ASCII-Doc is a format that makes it really easy to write documentation. Kind of looks like Markdown if you're familiar with that. And then ASCII-Doctor is a utility that you can use to convert ASCII-Doc files into other formats such as HTML, PDF, and you can even use it to write books. So I am going to show all of these examples with Gradle, but you could have a similar experience with any other build tool. Basic idea here is that you have to include it as dependency or applying the plugin, and then set up a few things as far as where you want the docs to go and how you want your documentation to look. Okay. So this is an example of just a simple ASCII doc of another API project that I'm a part of, and what I mean by this is that this file gets converted into a very nicely formatted HTML folder or HTML page, which of course you could do in other formats as well. So the next step, or next thing that you're going to want to have in your project is some sort of testing framework. In this case, we're going to show how it hooks in with mock MVC. So there are two ways to get started with mock MVC that are relevant to this. The first is that you can do a standalone setup, which just takes a simple controller and kind of mocks that out, and you can act like you're actually doing a request against that controller's endpoints. Yeah, so these are really just for simple examples. Most of what you're probably going to use is to actually set up your full context, and that way you can do things, particularly in Spring Boot, we talked about the way the error messages are handled all the same. Hopefully I can save you some time if you run into the same problem. If you're getting that your context is null, make sure that you have the right Spock dependency. I spent way too long trying to figure that out. Because it just says that there's no context, and it doesn't tell you that it's the Spring library that's the problem. Okay, so at this point we have some endpoints, we have some documentation, and we have some tests. Now we can actually start talking about how to add Spring REST docs. So you want to plug into your Gradle file, and you'll want to notice that there are two different versions. The first one for mock MVC, and there's a different one for rest assured. And we have to do a couple things in our ASCII doctor configuration so that it knows where to get the snippets that we're generating from Spring REST docs. Okay. So there's a few things in dependencies. So we want to set up an example documentation and specify where we want all of these things to go. And we hook in here, okay, and so what this does is that it gives this documentation tool access to your requests and your responses so that it can use those to verify it for testing purposes as well as use it to generate your snippets. This should look pretty similar to any HTTP client. And the thing that's relevant here is this and do step. The first thing is going to be where you want those snippets to go within your directory structure. And then you get to do a few different things. So you can pre-process them if you need to manipulate what URL it is, because this is running on a machine, so it's going to, by default, do localhost. And then you're going to want to document what your response is supposed to be. You'll notice pretty quickly that you don't want to keep writing these over and over again, so you can kind of mock out the structure and reuse those for all of your different tests. Okay, so just by having a few different lines, we get a lot of things by default. So in your generated snippets, you get a curl request, you get an HTTP request, an HTTP request if you're using version 1.1 or higher, as well as a default response. If you want these others, they're optional. So in order to get the request fields table, you have to specify that section in the test. And path parameters should be on this table as well. So what actually gets generated are ASCII doc snippets that can go into an HTML file and get converted to this. So in the first one, we have just your curl request with all of the parameters that you need to run this again, what your example is going to look like, as well as a table describing the structure of your response, including the type of it, and you can customize what message goes in that description. Okay, so that was just for a simple GET request. The next thing you may want to know is how to actually create one. So, or create something. So there are two things here. So you want to pass in the content, of course, and you can then document that by request fields. It looks pretty similar to response fields. And similarly, you'll get a request fields table instead of a response table, depending on what you want as your structure. One thing worth noting here that if you're reading through the documentation pretty quickly you may miss is that if you're doing lists of things, you're going to want to use square brackets to denote that that's nested. If it does have a name, you can also do A.B or any combination thereof, but this was just a little gotcha that tripped me up in the beginning. Similarly, path parameters are another thing that you can specify, and then that'll create a table as well. So at this point, you may start to notice that the order is going to really matter. So preprocessors are coming first, and then you can do your request fields and your responses. Okay. And if you try to do those in a different order, you'll start getting error messages, and that's probably what's happening. Okay. So that's kind of the long way to do it. That's how it was in the beginning. If you are in the special case where you're using Spring Boot 1.4 or higher and mock MVC, you can actually reduce a lot of this code. And there's now an annotation that's built in to auto-configure things, or auto-configure REST docs. So I have in this example here, all of the code that's commented out is what is generated by that annotation. And so it makes it a lot shorter. Okay. So now we have an idea of what the tests are going to look like. Hopefully, you generate one first that actually fails. So once a test fails, and this has to be one of the best features, is that you get some really detailed documentation as far as, or output, as far as what was expected that didn't show up, and maybe things that that were in the request response, whatever we're looking at, that we didn't expect to be there. It won't just handle names of things, but also types as well. Of course, in this example, I'm using JSON, and so there aren't very many types, but it'll still catch things like strings and numbers. Okay. So once you have all of your tests passing, you can go and take these snippets that are generated and add them into your documentation. And so if you aren't familiar with ASCII Doctor, there's just some syntax things here of how you include external files, snippets being a variable that I specified in the Gradle file for where all of these things live. Okay. So then what happens is that you may want to actually run your build. So you can run, and it's really important to hook these things up in the right way. You'll notice that in some of my Gradle files in the example projects that I want to make sure that my tests run first, because the tests are actually generating some of the code that I'm going to need later. And then it needs to run ASCII doc after that. Otherwise, you'll start getting these messages that say like that the reference can't be found. If that's the case, make sure that these are running in the right order. I usually run these as part of the build by default. So it'll take everything in that folder structure that I specified and convert that into an HTML page. So for this particular example, those are actually posted on GitHub pages, and you can take a look at those if you want. Okay, so that was mock MVC. The next thing that came up that was really excited is how do we do this for rest assured? Maybe if you're working in an environment where you're not in a Spring team, you can do this for Ratpack and Grails and other frameworks as well. So the next example is actually part of the official Ratpack project. It's probably the most valuable contribution that I've made to the project. And so I have in here a link to the particular pull request that walks through similar things of line by line, what's added. And, okay, so then I'm gonna go through a few of the specifics. So the first thing you want to know is that you're using a different dependency now. It's rest assured instead of the mock MVC. And just like with a change to any framework, your outpick directory is probably going to change as well. In if you're looking at this example, I did separate this out. So this is in a separate Gradle file. It's not part of your main build, and that's just a best practice. So you can see it in Gradle/ResDocs. Okay. So this is the way that Ratpack does some kind of strange things with route handling. And this may not look familiar, but what this is doing is that in the first example is just getting a book by its ISBN number. The second one is to get all of the books, and then the third one is to actually create new books. So you would, at this point, or maybe you already have the ASCII Doctor plugin done. So we can talk about what specifically Rest Assured does differently than the mock MVC version. Okay. So the setup for the documentation is going to be very similar, but it hooks in a way that's very different. So mock MVC is actually mocking out your application, but it's not running against the actual running application. Rest Assured does, and that makes it a little bit different. So you have to make sure that it's added as a filter now instead. And you have to be careful about what you do in this configuration step, particularly when we talk about URIs, because it actually will go against that address instead of maybe just running it locally like you want to in the case of a build. Okay. So you'll also notice some things in here that's probably a little bit small to read, but most of this just has to do with setting up test data and kind of cleaning up after every test. The point of that file that's relevant is this part. And so it's adding a filter instead of the undo, but everything else should pretty much look the same. You get the same data structures, you're pre-processing your response and requests, and this is what's a little bit different with the Rest Assured version, is that if you want to modify your URIs so that you're doing books.example.com instead of your local host, you have to do it as part of the processing and not as part of the Rest Assured configuration. Okay. However, that nice little tidbit also can be exploited for other things. So I published a blog post a couple weeks ago that you could actually set it up in the configuration to go against public APIs. So I took an example that uses just a JSON placeholder API and actually documented something that I had no control over. And you may think, why would I want to do this? But maybe it's something that you don't have direct access to in the project that you're working on, or you just want to document something else. There's a little bit more details in that blog post. Okay. So the next example is using Grails. I didn't see too many people here, but the example is a little bit dated, but the idea is that Grails has an option where you can just have an API profile that doesn't have any views. It's just your core service, and maybe that's something that you might do in another framework as well. Most of the rest of this is pretty similar, except the part where it's going to publish to GitHub pages. Okay, and actually I should note as well that this example project is not only in my GitHub repository, it's actually part of the official Spring ResDocs samples. So if you go to the Spring ResDocs project, and you can actually see this example as well. So the idea here is that you have an app that you created in place. It has two domain resources, the first one being a note, and then a note has tags. Everything in green here is just how we created that, and I'll skip over. ASCII Doctor plugin is really the same as the Rat Pack version with Rest Assured. Okay. One specific thing to note if you are a Grails user is to make sure that these steps are getting done appropriately. And in Grails, you need to make sure that it's running after your integration tests instead of after just the regular tests. And that's just a peculiarity of how Grails works in its testing, or at least it did when I created this example. Okay. So this should look pretty similar. It's, again, a filter. Okay. And that, we went over that. So the other option in cases where maybe you don't want to publish these documents with the project itself, you can publish them anywhere else. In this case, I'm using GitHub Pages, and there's a really nice Gradle plugin to do that. And it really just takes the repository, and then by default, these docs are going to go into build/docs based on my configuration. And it's going to publish those to GitHub Pages. You do have to really remember that if you're publishing your documentation somewhere else, that you can lose some of the advantages if you don't remember to deploy your docs at the same time as the project itself. And so the last thing is just another example on GitHub Pages that summarizes that example. So now, there are some outcomes. So we've had this project was something I started in the fall of 2015, and shortly after I left to go back to school in August, it finally made it to production. The team is still really happy with Spring REST docs, and particularly the other devs so this is a big enterprise, and we created a service and the other departments are trying to use it. Really like seeing the in-depth examples rather than just a list of URIs. Okay, and of course, there's a lot of things that I wasn't able to cover in this session. So if you're particularly interested in things like how to add security to your examples and how to document your constraints, if you want to do hypermedia support, you can, of course, read the documentation or watch one of the other videos. It's not just for JSON, of course. You can also use it to document XML. And there's a lot of other third-party extensions and things that are being built on top of this now, if you're using other things like WireMock or Jersey. Okay. So in conclusion, we found that API documentation is a really complex topic, particularly trying to centralize it. You should choose the tool that's right for your project. And sometimes that's not necessarily the one that's the easiest to set up. You want to make sure that it's easy to maintain in the long run and that your end users are happy with it. So we found that Spring REST docs is a promising tool for this and had some other advantages too, like making our test code more comprehensive and that our source code was easier to read when we switched from Swagger. And of course, I'm still not a fan of writing out manual documentation, but I found a way to make it a lot less painful. Thank you. What questions do you have? Yes?
How do you document the information being conveyed in the API?
I'm sorry, could you
rephrase?
The content.
Post or get or so. How is the structure of the data documented?
Okay. So to repeat, the question was, how do you document the structure of a request, for example, in ASCII doc? Okay. Let's see if I can find. So this is part of where I you add the snippet, so you can add any variety of text ahead and then include your response fields or the curl statements. Right now, that's still a manual process, but that's one of the things on the wish list is to get a better way to template that. And you're certainly welcome to use any of the features of Ask Doctor. I've really just started diving into this project, and I know that there's a lot more things that you can do with it that might make it easier. Are there any other questions? Well, actually, I'm sure there are questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking them in front of the entire group today, I will be around today and tomorrow. You can pester me on Twitter, and I'll be happy to help.